Welcome to the CEC Report for the 4th of December 2015. I'm Elisa Barwick, and joining me today is CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Elisa.
And on today's show, we'll discuss Uproar against climate imperialism defeats COP21 and Sabotage of anti-terror alliance fails for now. Now, before we get into it today, there is an announcement, which is that whilst Channel 44 channels around Australia will continue, they had an extension for another year, today's show will be the last program screened in Sydney. And that's because Sydney didn't get the extension for Channel 44, so they'll be going off air at the end of this year. So for all of our Sydney viewers, please go to our website, which we'll put up on the screen, and you can sign up for our regular emails, which will keep you informed of when the programs come out, or alternatively, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. So let's get started. Uproar against climate imperialism defeats COP21. So of course we've seen now the beginning of the UN climate change conference in Paris. It's of course still ongoing for a couple of more weeks, but all of the world leaders have come and gone. They've had their photo sessions and whatnot. And even before the conference began, Craig, they had already announced from key organisers onward that there would not be a legally binding agreement. Now, the stated aim of the conference, to quote their own website, was to, quote, for the first time in 20 years of UN negotiations, achieve a legally binding and universal agreement on climate. So, and that was basically the one aim, which they have not done and they will not do because of the opposition which we'll go through, which has come mainly from the developing countries.
Also led by the BRICS, I think, in particular. That's
right.
Because, look, this is seen as eco-fascism. It's seen to be a direct attack on the development of developing countries.
And this was despite, as we've reported on this show, the royal family taking a leading role in this conference, succeeding as they did at the 2009 conference of the UN in Copenhagen. But they did include in the lead up the CHOGM event in Malta of 27 to 29 November, which was described, by the way, as the Canadian Foreign Minister as a training camp for the Paris conference. And the new Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, was given the role of trying to whip into motion all of the Commonwealth countries to support a binding agreement. But for one, the Indian delegation immediately said, look, we should not go with any ambitious statements, we have to be realistic.
And even, I think, Malcolm Turnbull saw the dangers of this because Australia refused to sign the official communique, which would have locked us out from any sort of subsidies to the coal industry. And as we know, our economy is crashing, it's tanking. We're heavily reliant on the mining sector, and this would have just been another real blow to any sort of economics in our country.
Yeah, and they'd also marshalled all the religions. I mean, you'd had the role of Schellenhuber, the climate envoy to the Queen, Hans Schellenhuber, who had helped to put together the encyclical by the Pope and to pull together basically under those umbrellas of major religions, millions of faithful. So even that didn't work. You had Charles whipping up fear about how climate change was what has actually caused the crisis in Syria and the flood of refugees into Europe. So, you know, despite all of that, it has not succeeded. Now, I want to go through some of the opposition that came from the developing countries and some of the stunning quotes, because they did describe this as climate or carbon imperialism in many cases. The Power Minister of India, Piers Corbyn, said, "We are not at all apologetic about using coal. America and the Western world has developed on the back of cheap energy from coal for the last 150 years. And on the back of this low-cost energy, they made their highways, their railroads, factories, manufacturing, etc. So in other words, it was okay for you, but now that you've developed, you can't write it off for the rest of us." Then you had Arvind Subramanian, the Chief Economic Advisor to the Modi government in India. He called for a Manhattan Project for coal and called for he called the campaign to end the use of fossil fuels, carbon imperialism. And he said such imperialism on the part of advanced nations could spell disaster for India and other developing countries. He said coal will and should remain the country's primary energy source because it is the cheapest fuel available. From China, you had the state-run English language daily paper, the Global Times, saying on 29th November that many of the leaders attending the COP21 summit are only going to ensure that their countries don't end up sacrificed on the altar of climatism. And then you had a French economist, Rémi Prudhomme, in Le Figaro 27 November, exposing global warming imperialism. And he said efforts to shut down coal-fired electricity production in Africa and India is a colonial policy. And from the United States, a former NASA scientist and meteorologist, Tom Weissmuller, and this was in the Cameroonian weekly tabloid called Integration, in which he did an interview, denounced the hoax, saying that if all the proposals to be put before COP21 were to be adopted, humankind would be thrown back to the Stone Age.
But that's the intention, Elisa.
Exactly.
We've said this many times on this program. The intention of the royals, Prince Philip, Schellenhuber and so forth, is to reduce the world's population down to below 1 billion people. This is what this is. It's an imperial policy of population reduction.
And finally, you had a South African engineer who wrote a paper, Andrew Kenny, and he made clear that the hoaxers' prescriptions will prevent industrialisation and will keep billions of people in poverty. Again, finally people are coming out reflecting what we have been saying for a very long time. But I will note that there was a group of scientists, including 3 Americans and 1 Australian at Copenhagen, at the COP21 in Paris, who called for nuclear power in order to stop global warming. And one of the Americans actually said, look, we need to be building at least 1 new nuclear power plant every week somewhere in the globe if we're serious about overcoming this. And that really is the issue, because how can developing countries develop? I mean, they're not going to build their industry with solar-powered factories. And in the first place, even to build the solar capabilities, they would have to have the coal-powered stations and so forth.
I think China's very clear on this, Elisa, because it's got a very large population and it's had a large population. It's still got a large population of very poor people. Now, China, from some of the discussions I've been part of with the BRICS countries, has come out very clearly and said, look, the only way that you can develop your population is by developing higher technologies, more energy-dense technologies. That means a commitment to nuclear power and also nuclear fusion, which means that's the next generation, which they're working on for the development of, helium-3 and so forth, right? Which is gives vast amounts more energy into the processes that you can use for manufacturing and so forth. China knows that. They've been able to, through the last 30 years, lift up hundreds of millions of their population through this idea. So they're not going to go and push solar power. And the same with the Indians. They know they've a large population. The only way you can do is to deal with that, to lift up large numbers of population, is to go with the most advanced forms of technology. Solar power, these very weak energy flux density, that's the amount of energy per square metre, or you want to also by mass, where you have very little energy in that energy flux density. You can't even build solar panels with solar power.
Yeah.
There's not enough power there to do it. So you actually need higher forms. Now that we've been reliant on coal for many, many years, and it's been very cheap, as these commentators and these leaders have said. Australia's benefited from that. Now we actually, relatively to a lot of places in the world, a very wealthy country. How come? It's because we've had vast amounts of raw materials which we've been able to develop. So this idea of restricting access to even basic huge amounts of coal for countries to actually develop their roads and infrastructure is an imperial policy. But again, we come back, the CEC comes, we promote the absolute necessity for Australia to go nuclear. We've got the resources, we've got both larger reserves of uranium than most countries. We've got also thorium-based power. We know that India is developing thorium-based nuclear reactors, but we also should be sharing and developing with China and India the capacity to develop this new fusion energy capacity. And a whole raft of new technologies will come from this, new industry processes, which are going to develop the world and develop vast areas of the poor populations. And this is what the developing countries want. They don't want to be told by all the wealthy countries, you cannot develop yourself.
Yeah, you can't do what we did.
And the BRICS countries, right, have been leading the revolution against this paradigm, both in this idea of what a nation should be. You know, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa are saying, no, we are not. We want to be sovereign countries. We want to be able to develop ourselves and our peoples. That's in direct contravention to the imperial oligarchical view of the royals, of Schellenhuber and others that say, no, you have to accept what we give you. You have to look at climate change as being a real thing because we say so. But yes, okay, it's going to destroy your populations, but you have to take this. You have to just put up with this. Well, these countries are saying we're not going to do that.
Yeah, no.
That's what you see with the COP21. That's what you saw with Copenhagen.
Exactly, which is fortunate. And we'll stop there. But after the break, we're going to come back to the BRICS countries because a number of BRICS countries are playing a key role in setting up a peaceful world and putting down the likes of ISIS. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Sabotage of anti-terror alliance fails for now. Now, just following on what we were discussing about the failure of COP21 and global warming, it was interesting that the brother of Jeremy Corbyn, the new leader of the opposition in the United Kingdom, Piers Corbyn, and he's the head of a group called Weather Action, which are opposing this whole idea of shutting down development under the name of global warming. In one of his articles on his website this week, he said, "The truth is, big backers of ISIS terror and all who profit from the war and climate change lies are one and the same." And as we were just pointing out, not all people in the UK are willing to admit this, but it is the royal family that is heading the charge for this.
And we've made this very clear in our publications where we pointed out that Prince Charles, through his conduits with the Saudis, has been a direct and very responsible for the funding of the terrorist groups. And people can call in to get a copy of that. But just in the recent days, there's been a number of developments in terms of the war against terrorism and against ISIS from a couple of standpoints, good and bad. The UK, of course, voted yesterday to bomb Syria in addition to Iraq and proceeded within an hour or so to do that immediately. The United States has announced that they'll be sending 200 boots on the ground into Iraq, and there are fears that that will extend into Syria because once they're there, it becomes a bit of a blur. But these are hunt and kill special forces that are basically sent in to assassinate leaders of ISIS. By the way, these are totally illegal, Elisa.
Yeah.
The only country that has the legal mandate to go into Syria or Iraq is Russia.
They have the permission
because they've got the permission
Syria.
of the sovereign governments. So what is happening here with the UK and the US is totally illegal.
Yes. Now also, NATO have announced that they're increasing defences in Turkey, sending in new fighter planes and anti-aircraft missiles. And of course this comes in the wake of the Russian fighter jet that were in there, doing the hard yards, putting down ISIS, and they've been very successful at that. And of course their plane gets shot down by Turkey. But what we want to talk a bit about in this segment is the fact that you've had a number of attempts from the Russian plane that was shot down, a passenger jet over the Sinai in Egypt, to the attack in Paris, which happened at a point when the Russian offensive against ISIS was just proceeding very well. And then you had the shoot down of this Russian fighter jet. So these are attempts to sabotage the successful cooperation that is actually destroying ISIS in a way that the US for 14 months, did not do at all, and to put the world back onto a war footing, which in light of the financial meltdown is what the financial oligarchy need to contain the situation and maintain control. So the successful situation came, in putting down ISIS, came beginning at the point of the 28th September speech that Putin gave at the UN General Assembly, where he said to the Americans in that speech, "Do you realise what you have done?" Because basically he pointed to the fact that their wars of regime change have led to this situation. They went in with a military offensive immediately and drew blood. They then launched a diplomatic flank which led to a very successful series of conferences in Vienna, which brought together 20 plus nations to solve the situation on the ground in Syria. And then the crucial intervention, as we've discussed last week and before, was the flank that Putin launched at the G20 in Turkey, where he hit the funding of ISIS and the protection racket that are allowing them to export oil and so forth, naming 40 countries that are involved in protecting and funding ISIS, including members of the G20. And of course that would include Saudi Arabia and Turkey. Now, at that point of that G20, there was a complete shift in regard to Putin, who'd been the pariah. Even Julie Bishop was saying, well, we can work with Russia. The French and the Russians, after Paris, agreed to cooperate. There were calls for a World War II anti-Nazi style alliance coming from all over the globe.
And we can't forget that we've had these massive refugees behind the scenes, which really did start to trigger off the consciousness of the European countries about what is actually taking place in Syria.
And to support what Russia's doing, because they see that that's vital. But all of this process led by Russia set off a landslide where you began to have numerous voices saying that the US coalition spared ISIS up until this point. They spared the oil, they didn't go in and bomb the oil. Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, actually said the US looks like a cat that wants to eat a fish but doesn't want to wet its feet. You know, they're basically putting up a pretense of fighting ISIS. Russia, on the other hand, has destroyed 32 oil production facilities, 11 refineries, 23 oil pumping stations, 1,080 tankers, and reduced oil turnover by almost 50% and halved the income of ISIS overnight. In the US, you've had a reaction. Tulsi Gabbard, who's a representative in the Congress from Hawaii, and another MP organised a bill to ban US assistance to Syrian opposition groups. Virginia Senator Richard Black said that people have begun realising that the Syrian terrorists are militarily supported by our allies, Turkey, Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Senator Rand Paul called for sanctions on Saudi Arabia and cutting off arms sales to Saudi Arabia, which is the biggest partner in arms with America. There have been much more media attention to the funding and the ideology of the Saudi role and how airstrikes alone can't stop ISIS. We have to actually go in and tackle the causality of the problem. Even 4 ex-drone pilots wrote an open letter to Obama demanding they stop the drone killings, which is contributing to, recruiting more terrorists. You had a whole operation where British Prime Minister Cameron and Obama tried to put Hollande off from working with Putin, and they both met with Hollande before he travelled to Russia to meet with Putin to make sure that they would stop any kind of really strong alliance developing between France and Russia. And that failed. Russian analysts described the meeting that took place on the 26th of November in Moscow between Putin and Hollande as a colossal breakthrough.
All of this, Elisa, is blowing up Obama's policy, and the guy's losing it.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's very important people understand there's been actually a significant breakthrough in the last 24 to 48 hours in the US, in that you've had a number of different media outlets publicly come and call for the invokement of the Amendment 25, which is basically saying our president is no longer fit to be in office.
Mentally unfit to serve as president, yeah.
Now, the background of this is when he went to COP21, all the heads of state were given 3 minutes. Obama took 14 minutes. And in that 14 minutes, he said the word or 330 times. He didn't have a teleprompter.
Yeah, that's his problem.
And people are saying, this guy's lost it. And consequently, you've had the Washington Post, the Washington Times and Examiner.com come out and say there should be a meeting of the Senate to immediately evoke Amendment 25. This guy's lost it. So all the events, and this has been put in place by Putin, because once Putin went into Syria, the whole world transformed in terms of what was, and the spotlight was put on the failed policies of the Obama administration and the Bush policy before
They're exposed.
And so Obama's losing it. This is reflecting back into the US, and now you're getting calls for his effective impeachment by the Article 25. Now this is really quite significant.
Yeah, there's an alliance for peace. It comes back into the BRICS Alliance for Development, which is burgeoning. And basically, you're not going to get war, you're not going to get destabilisation like you've got in the Northern Africa, Middle East region under that new policy. And they have to stop at all costs what Putin has started here.
That's right.
And they are desperate, so you're going to see more provocations. But we'll come back to this after a quick break. Welcome back to the CEC Report, where we're discussing sabotage of anti-terror alliance fails for now. So we just discussed that alliance, and I want to just mention that where Russia is pushing things next, they're working with Syria to close the border with Turkey to stop the oil, because there was a briefing that was done to the media by a whole bunch of top Russian military leaders just yesterday, and they used satellite videos and maps to show Turkey's quote-unquote business with ISIS terrorists. And these videos show convoys crossing freely into Turkey. They are not stopped at the border whatsoever. They're not checked in any way. You have Turkish ports that are identified in these images, which have special areas for tankers where oil is loaded and transferred for processing. So basically the quantities are all known, and the Russians have said, we'll post the coordinates of the queues of oil tankers on our website so that other members of the coalition can actually help us take them.
Yeah, ISIS has 8,500 tankers shifting 200,000 tonnes of oil per day. So consequently, this is the funding pipeline for ISIS. And that's what Russia is now saying, we have to destroy that. Now, this is black market oil. This is completely legitimate oil in terms of it is funding terrorism.
Yeah.
So you can see why Turkey is not very happy about this, because this represents a major hit to their own.
Yeah, it funded the whole election campaign of Erdogan, as we've exposed previously.
Yeah, so this is a major escalation on behalf of the Russians, but it's a correct one, because as he said, as Putin went to the G20, he says, look, you've got to cut off the funding. There's 40 countries involved in supporting ISIS financially. If you want to actually deal with the war, or this war against terrorism, you have to cut off the funding lines.
Yeah. But we want to conclude the show by discussing the fact that despite all of this push for war, and it's dicey from from day to day, the BRICS countries are still forging forward with the development. And of course, it was September 2013 when the Chinese President Xi Jinping really put this into high gear when he went to Kazakhstan and he launched the Silk Road as an international project. He later invited even the United States and other countries to be involved. You had the July 2014 Fortaleza Declaration of the BRICS, which then moved it forward the next step. And since then, of course, we saw the AIIB in March at the time of our conference, that the AIIB originally was just China, and all Western countries were saying, we're not going to be a part of that, we don't trust China. But then all of a sudden you had an absolute flood where you now have 57 nations that are a part of that. You had the shift in Europe and the UK even joining. We've seen the rise of Jeremy Corbyn in the UK to the opposition leadership, talking about people's quantitative easing, people's credit to fund development. You had the fault lines in Greece, where they, tried to take on the EU and failed in the end, but nonetheless, that courage to stand up, we're not going to have austerity for the people, is a crucial thing. The refugee crisis, as you mentioned earlier, is bringing this to a head for Europe.
Well, the only way to solve the refugee crisis is to have a massive economic development project for Syria and for Iraq and for Libya and for these other countries that have been decimated by war. Unless you do that, solve the war through what's been done by Russia and others in order to stem the flow of funds, but then take the necessary funding through the AIIB and other institutions and literally create a coalition for peace and development in that region, we're not going to have the sort of peace that's necessary, long-standing, sustainable peace.
So the drive led by Russia to put down and end war and end terrorism is a crucial element of that. Find out more in our Australian Alert Service. Sign up to our YouTube channel, especially you Sydney-siders. Thanks, Craig.
You're welcome.
Thanks for joining us again, and see you next week for the CEC Report.